Welcome back. In this second video, I'll be showing you how to use the step-by-step lesson plan portion of the teacher's guides for the Core Knowledge Language Arts Skills curriculum strand. Now, if you haven't done so yet, be sure to watch video number 1 where I show you the 2 sets of curriculum files you'll need to download from the Core Knowledge website, as well as how to use the introduction section, which contains information you'll need to teach the unit to your student. There's also very important information in that video about how Core Knowledge Language Arts is structured for kindergarten through 3rd grade, and how this curriculum strand, the skills curriculum strand, differs from the listening and learning curriculum strand you'll likely also be using with your student. Now, before we start looking at those lesson plans, a quick reminder that you can download the free daily work plans and other support materials from my website. That's homeschoolworkplans.com. And the free Core Knowledge curriculum is available through the Core Knowledge Foundation at the website you see here. Now, specifically for this video, I'm going to be showing you how to work through a lesson with your student using the first grade teacher's guide and other materials. However, all the Core Knowledge kindergarten through 3rd grade language arts skills units are set up in the same way. So the information in this video will still apply even if you're using a different unit or a different grade level. All right, so let's get started on our detailed tour of an example lesson. All right, so for today's example lesson, I'm going to show you the 3rd unit for 1st grade. Now, there are 7 skills units scheduled for 1st grade, and this first unit has 19 lessons, and there's a pausing point scheduled as well. Now, the good news is that you don't have to figure out which week and day of the school year to schedule each of these lessons. I have that free schedule for you you can download from my website. With that schedule in hand, you'll always know exactly what to cover each day, not only for this curriculum, but also for the Core Knowledge History and Geography curriculum and Science and the Listening and Learning strand. All of that's planned out for you. Now, the lessons in these skills units typically consist of several different activities, and while core skills tend to be covered daily, secondary skills are covered on a rotating schedule. I'm going to walk you through an example lesson, and I'll show you how to use that pausing point too at the end of the unit. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at this daily schedule you can download from my website so you can understand how all this works together. All right, so here on Thursday of week 14 for 1st grade, you'll see that lesson 12 is scheduled for this 3rd unit. So let's dive in and take a detailed look at lesson 12. Every lesson in a skills unit starts out with a page just like this one. In the top right-hand corner, you'll see the words basic code. Now, this is telling you the focus of this lesson. In this case, the core teaching for this lesson will be focused on learning how to use the phonograms and rules for reading and spelling. Now, phonograms and rules make up the code of the English language. And so some lessons will say things like tricky spelling words or grammar or spelling assessment or review. That will be the core objective for the lesson. Now, below that, you'll see a list of objectives for the lesson. And I want to pause here for a moment and tell you something important. I recognize that this long list of bolded words is really overwhelming to look at. This is enough to make most homeschooling parents, including me, panic, close the book, find something else to use. Too much going on here, right? I want to ask you to stay with me, though. It's not as bad as it looks. In fact, you don't technically even have to read this list of objectives. This list and those little numbers after each item are primarily for the benefit of classroom teachers needing to align to state standards. As I mentioned in the part 1 video, this really isn't something as homeschoolers we typically need to worry about. Now, if you'd like to read it, you certainly can, but I'd much prefer you put your energy into the next section and the step-by-step lesson instructions because those are what really matter here. If you follow the step-by-step lesson instructions we'll be looking at on the next page, your student will accomplish the objectives listed here, even if you don't read them. Okay, so let's do ourselves a favor and not read the long list of objectives right now. Instead, we're going to move on to the more important at-a-glance section, which is that table at the bottom of the page. This section is an overview of the tasks you'll be working through with your student during this lesson. Now, the 3rd column over has a list of materials, so you can make sure you have those items on hand. And I'm going to show you all of these items, all of these different materials as we work through this lesson. But for example, right at the top for the warm-up, you'll need the large letter cards E, A, I, U, E, E, O, U, and O, O. Now, remember in the first video, we talked about how those large letter cards are one PDF file, and you're just going to need to open that file and navigate to the page when the lesson tells you to? That's right. That's all you're going to be doing. Now, if you choose to print the cards, you'll just want to have the stack of cards nearby so you can grab them when it's time to use them. And by all means, if you have the ability to print these cards, it's great. It makes it a little bit more convenient. But I also want to make sure that this program, the way I have this set up for you, means that you don't have to print everything. If printing is a problem for you, I want you to have all your options available. All right, so if we go down a little bit on that chart, the same things, same basic concepts apply with the vowel code flipbook, the spelling cards, and the individual code chart called for the introducing the spelling part of the lesson. Those, again, are all those PDF files. They were included in the ancillary materials folder you downloaded from the Core Knowledge website. If you printed them, again, you're just going to have them nearby, but otherwise, you'll just open those files when they're called for in the lesson. It's going to tell you, don't worry about it. All right, next line down is calling for worksheet 12.1. And then the next two lines after that call for the reader in worksheets 12.2 and 12.3. Now, in the part 1 video, I mentioned that you are going to need to print the workbook for each unit. And those worksheets are just in the workbook, and I promise they are clearly marked 12.1, 12.2, 12.3. You are not going to have to hunt for these. And then the Fables reader listed there is just that student reader you downloaded for the unit. So really all this is the teacher's guide, the student reader, and the workbook, and those ancillary materials. It's not quite as bad as it seems. Now you'll also see a note there about needing a green marker. That was mentioned in the supply list in the introduction portion of the teacher's guide. But remember, if you've downloaded that free organization and prep documents from my website, you'll see that green marker on the general first grade supply list. It's commonly used in these skill units throughout the school year. So chances are, if you're using my prep documents, you already have all of these common supplies ready to go. All right, a quick note before we move on. On the far right-hand side of the table, there are time estimates listed. These time estimates are for a classroom full of children. So I would recommend taking these with a grain of salt as a homeschooler, because it's easy to look at these and panic a little bit. It is almost always more efficient to give a lesson to one child in a one-on-one tutoring type environment, like what we're doing when we're homeschooling, than it is to give a lesson to 30 kids at once. You'll often see estimates for these skill lessons of around 75 minutes for a classroom setting, so that's a block for a classroom teacher. Well, it can vary from day to day. Generally speaking, you can probably plan to spend about half, maybe 3/4 of that amount of time when working just with one student. Now, as I mentioned in the language arts listening and learning video, if you've seen that, if you are an experienced homeschooler, you already have figured out that how a lesson goes each day, how much time a lesson takes is really going to depend on a lot of factors that have to do with how much caffeine you've had as a parent, how motivated your child is for that particular school day. So sometimes you're going to get these lessons done in 30 minutes. Sometimes it'll take longer. Hopefully it will be on the shorter side for you on a regular basis. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the step-by-step lesson plans. And I want to start, though, by giving you 2 pieces of advice that should make using this curriculum easier. First, if at all possible, read through the lesson carefully the night before. Make sure you understand each activity, because if you do, you'll be less likely to be spending time fumbling around or rereading sections while your student is sitting there. This is sort of like a new job, right? We have to kind of learn the skills and kind of get a flow, a rhythm and a flow going on. All right, next, follow the step-by-step instructions laid out in the lesson as precisely as you can. Core knowledge is what is known as a scripted curriculum. It's going to tell you exactly what you need to tell your student, what piece or pieces of materials to show them, what questions to ask, and so forth. There's no guesswork needed here. Now, especially if you're new to teaching reading, spelling, grammar, those sorts of things, or if you're just new to the core knowledge curriculum, this isn't a great time to get creative. I would really recommend with the skills curriculum that you work through the lesson as closely as possible to how it is laid out, and your odds of it going more smoothly will be higher, because this is technical to a certain extent, right? We're teaching them to do things like reading and spelling, and there's some precision involved here. And, I know it's hard sometimes to stick with a lesson exactly as it's written, but I'm saying this as someone who has made the mistake over the years of, deviating too far from the lesson when it's something technical like this, and it just really doesn't do us any good. We end up having to go back and kind of redo things. Okay, so stick with the lesson as best you can. All right, so having said all that, let's take a look at this first page of the lesson. Now, every lesson is going to start with a warm-up activity to transition your student to working on their skills lesson, and the warm-up is often going to be some sort of review from something they've learned in a previous lesson. So for example, in this lesson, it directs you to show them those large letter cards, E, A, I, U, E, E, O, U, and O, O. And there they are. And you'll work through the instructions where you'll review with your student that each of those letters or letter combinations makes more than one sound. Now, the next section gets into the core teaching for this lesson, where you'll be introducing the student to a new sound, the letters O-I, which say oi. Now, the lesson here will guide you through step by step, having your student practice a sound, asking the student to help you come up with words that use that sound, and so on. All right, so let's move on to that next page that will build on that phonogram and sound they just learned. This section right up front in the gray box tells you that in this activity, you will show the student page 14 of the vowel code flip book and the spelling card. All right, so there are those materials. And you'll have that handy because you'll either open that file and ancillary components folder, right? And that's that folder you downloaded from the website, or you'll have printed the flip book and you'll have it right there next to you. And then step by step, you'll be guided through how to model for your student how to write OI, O-I, using neat penmanship, and then how to use O-I in spelling. You'll also be prompted to have students turn to page 4 of the individual code chart. And again, they'll either open that file on their tablet, or if you printed that file, it should be nearby. All right, and finally in that first section there, it guides you on how to explain to them how to use the worksheet. So next you'll move on to the section at the bottom for writing the spellings / word box. First, it will have you write OI on the board, and again, remind the student how to write OI using neat penmanship. And then remind the student that OI is a letter team that work together to make the OI sound. And then you'll work through the steps where your student will use the worksheet 12.1 located in the workbook you printed for this unit. And you see 12.1 there right at the top. You're not going to have to search for this. Okay, so there's there are the worksheets right there so you can see them. And once you've completed that worksheet, you'll move on to the next page of the teacher's guide. All right, so moving on to the next page, you'll see a small group activity. Now remember, this curriculum was written to be used in schools in a classroom setting. So sometimes as homeschoolers, we have to make some adjustments to the activity to make it work for our situation. So in this example lesson, this one is an easy adjustment. Instead of your student working in a small group to work through the activity, you and your student will be a small group and work together. Okay, so let's look at this set of instructions for the bag of coins, which is the title of the story they'll be reading during this activity. First, you'll see instructions for how to preview the story with your student and how to preview the spellings they will be seeing in the reading for this lesson. In particular, you'll be guided through how to show them words in groups, organized around the letter teams they've learned, as well as some tricky words they'll see when they're doing their reading. Next, you'll work through the section on previewing the vocabulary they'll be using during this story. For example, you may need to clarify what foot of the tree means and what a bad spot means. Your kids may or may not know that already. You'll then be guided through a question to ask your student about the reading before they start and encouraging them to read the story to find out the answer. So the next section might be just a bit confusing, and I just want to warn you up front because this is written for a classroom setting. So it's going to talk about different instructions for different groups of kids. And in this case, the assumption is that there's a group of kids who need extra guidance from the teacher and then a group of students who can work in pairs and giving them instructions on what they can do if they finish early. Now, of course, you can essentially ignore this section because you're working side by side, one-on-one with your student as they read the story and complete the worksheet. And to read the story, remember, you're just going to open the student reader file on your student's tablet so they can read it right there. You probably aren't going to print this. They're color pages. It gets really expensive to print unless you have several kids coming behind them. All right, now I'll go ahead and put a few samples of that bag of coins story from the reader as well as the worksheet so you can see those. Right there. And then once you've completed those worksheets, you can check them using the answer key in the back of the teacher's guide if you'd like. And then we'll move on to the last section for the wrap-up, which will guide you through filling out a chart of the story. That wrap-up does then continue onto this next page, okay? In this gray box, you'll find questions to discuss with your student about the story they just read. The last section of the lesson is entitled Take-Home Material. And again, this is designed for classrooms where a teacher would be sending simple worksheets home with the student to review with their parents. Now, as a homeschooler, of course, your student already is home, so the take-home materials are optional. Now, when I use this curriculum with my own kids, I typically will have them work through those extra materials. It's really good practice. I don't want them to be missing that practice time. But sometimes I'll skip them. If we're running out of time in our school day, if it's clear that my child already has a really good grasp on that concept, we'll go ahead and sometimes skip the extra worksheets. Okay, so let's assume though for a moment you've decided to have your student work on these extra materials before you end the lesson. Let's just take a quick look at them here. The first instruction is that you'll be using worksheet 12.3. So you see that up at the top. That's located again in the workbook. And then the specific instructions for this worksheet actually happen to be listed on the worksheet because it's meant to be sent home to a parent. And as you read through the rest of this section, you'll see a variety of suggestions as well for things that your student could practice, use to practice what they've learned. So things like practicing newly decodable words. A decodable word, by the way, is a word where a child has already learned the letter sounds and should be able to sound it out to read the word. There's also a suggestion for making word chains, something you'll have been taught to do in a previous lesson. And finally, there's some phrases and short sentences you can have the student practice reading. So there's that extra material too to provide extra practice and potentially some challenge. All right, so if you have extra time, you can do that. But otherwise, this really brings us to the end of the lesson. At the bottom of that page, though, you'll see a box, and you'll often find this at the end of lessons, and it walks you through where your child is in the learning to read process, but both before and after this lesson. So that can be kind of encouraging sometimes to see the type of progress you're making. Okay, so like I said, that's it. Keep in mind that other lessons during the week will also cover things like grammar, composition, and language mechanics skills, such as punctuation. So lessons are a little different each day, but every lesson will be laid out in the same step-by-step manner that tells you exactly how to present the material to your student. Now, a quick note before we move on. The lesson I just walked you through is from the middle of the school year, and I chose that lesson because it's representative of most of the lessons you'll teach your student during the school year. But I do want to take a minute and let you know that the first skills unit of each grade level has a different flow to it than the other units. And I'm actually going to put some videos together, hopefully in the next couple weeks, specifically looking at these early lessons in each grade level, okay? Because they really are different. But for the moment, I just want to give you a general overview so you're prepared to tackle those. All right, so the first unit of each grade level assumes that your student took the summer off, and they might be a little rusty on their skills. Now, even if you aren't starting this curriculum at the beginning of the school year after having the summer off, you may have just removed your child from a public or private school, or you might be in the process of switching curriculum. So under any of those circumstances, you'll want to work through that first unit and then all the units in the skills curriculum in order. Okay, so here on the screen, I've put the table of contents for the first unit of first grade, so you can get a feel for what I'm talking about here. So the first week of the unit is focused on reviewing what they would have previously learned in a kindergarten curriculum. And then the second week, there are assessments to double check that they're ready to move on to the new material in this new school year. And those assessments are not scary, I promise. They're often reading a page of material and then maybe answering some questions, something like that. I cannot emphasize enough, though, that working through these assessments is really important. Every child should have the opportunity to learn to read well, and knowing where they're truly at in their school level will allow you to make adjustments as needed so they can learn these skills they need to move forward, because no child's needs are served moving them ahead before they've mastered the previous material. All right, now I recognize that it might sound a little scary to do review if you've never taught these skills before, or to do an assessment if you've never done that before. But don't worry. As with everything in this curriculum, there are step-by-step lessons in that assessment section, so you'll know exactly what materials to have your student work through and how to understand where their skill level is at. Now, that first unit with the review portion of the assessment is different enough, like I said, that I'm going to go ahead and do some separate videos shortly to walk you through exactly how to do those lessons. But the same ideas you saw in the lesson I just showed you that we went through in detail are still going to apply. You'll want to read each lesson carefully the night before and follow each lesson step by step. Now, especially if you're new to homeschooling or just new to the core knowledge curriculum, that first unit may feel bumpy and overwhelming, and that tends to be the nature of new things, right? It takes us a little bit of time to learn the material. So this way of teaching may be new to both you and your student. So I'd really encourage you to be patient with yourself, patient with your child, and just work through the lessons methodically. And ultimately, don't give up. Okay, the lesson I just walked you through seemed like something you could do, right? Even if a review lesson at the beginning of a unit seems harder to work through, it gets easier as you get more experience and you move on to presenting new material. So stick with it. You'll be amazed at how much progress your student will make. Okay, so let's jump back to the daily schedule you can download from my website. And you'll see here that on Tuesday, week 16, there is a pausing point scheduled for this unit. Now, every skills unit for kindergarten through third grade contains a pausing point day at the end of the unit. So let's go back to the teacher's guide and take a look at how the pausing points work. For each unit, you will have 1 day scheduled at the end for the pausing point. The pausing point is a great time to review what the student has learned so far in the unit and take time to reinforce that information with a variety of activities. Now, the pausing point section of the teacher's guide is going to walk you through the topics available for review and give you a number of options for activities on that school day. There are a lot of options in this section, okay? It could be a little bit overwhelming, and I want to be clear that you're not going to be working on all of these activities in one day. You're just going to be choosing one or two, and which ones you choose is likely going to be driven by some of those last lessons you worked on right before this pausing point, because there's some assessments sprinkled in there, and you'll have seen, well, maybe your child didn't quite grasp a certain reading concept or a grammar concept or something like that, and then that will kind of drive which of these pausing point activities you choose. Now, I do typically suggest that you try to look at that pausing point at least a week in advance so you can decide which activities you might be interested in doing because, about a week before the end of the unit, you probably have a pretty good idea of how things are going. Now, there really are typically not any extra materials needed that you would normally have on hand anyway, but just in case, it's worth noting if there are any supplies that you'll need to gather. Worst case, there might be a craft supply or two that's needed. Now, the activities suggested for the pausing point days are fun. They're great ways to reinforce what your student has learned. However, if you reach the pausing point in a unit and you're running behind schedule on the core lessons in the unit, please use this day to catch up on the core lessons instead. These pausing point activities are optional. It's much more important to complete all the core lessons in each unit before moving on. All right, so that concludes our tour of the lesson plans portion of the Skills Teacher's Guide. So before you go, remember that all these core knowledge teacher's guides for language arts skills from kindergarten through third grade are laid out in basically the same way, right? So now that you've gone through this video, you're going to have a good feel for how to work through any of the grade levels and work through those skills lessons. Okay, and please be sure to download that organization and prep document set from my website. They're free. I've done all this organization and scheduling work for you. I went through and dug through all of these units and found all of the supplies and the different interesting things that you need to know. And then there's that daily schedule you'll want so you can know what you're going to do each school day. All right, I also have more videos and more materials on my website because I really do want to help you give your child a high quality, affordable education at home. All right, so that's it for this video. Best wishes on your homeschooling journey.